December 17th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. Snow falls through skeletal trees, muffling the thunder of artillery that rolls across the Belgian countryside like a distant storm. Through the morning mist, a column of American armor crawls forward, exhaust plumes trailing behind each vehicle like ghosts. 3rd Armored Division, Combat Command B, spearhead of Patton's relief force, racing toward Bastogne. Inside the lead Sherman, the air smells of cordite, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. Staff Sergeant Thomas Kowalski hunches in the loader's position, surrounded by 75mm shells racked along the turret wall. Each round weighs 15 pounds. Each one, he knows, is practically useless against what's waiting in those woods. The radio crackles. Contact front, Tiger, 800 yards. Kowalski's hands move automatically, fingers wrapping around the next shell. But his mind is already calculating angles he shouldn't be thinking about, modifications he shouldn't be attempting, a desperate idea born from 3 months of watching his rounds bounce harmlessly off German armor while his friends burned alive. Today, that changes. Today, a 23-year-old loader from Pittsburgh is about to do something no training manual ever taught, no officer ever authorized, and no engineer ever imagined possible. Today, improvisation becomes innovation. By December 1944, the Western Allies had learned a brutal truth. The M4 Sherman tank, backbone of American armored forces, was outmatched by German heavy armor in almost every measurable way. The numbers told a grim story. A Tiger tank's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick. Its 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from over 3,000 meters away. Meanwhile, the standard 75mm gun, mounted on most Shermans, could barely scratch a Tiger's paint at that distance. Even at point-blank range, a direct frontal shot stood little chance of penetration. The mathematics of death were simple. In a head-on engagement, the Sherman lost, every time. Tank crews knew this. They'd developed tactics to compensate: flanking maneuvers, numerical superiority, combined arms coordination. The unofficial doctrine was clear. It took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, 4 to distract it while the 5th got around to its vulnerable rear armor. Those 4 rarely survived the encounter. Staff Sergeant Thomas Kowalski had loaded shells into Marianne, his Sherman tank, through 17 major engagements since Normandy. He'd seen firsthand what happened when 75mm rounds met Tiger armor. The distinctive clang of a ricochet, the desperate call over the intercom for another round, the sickening realization that nothing in the ammo rack would make a difference. And then, all too often, the flash of an incoming 88mm shell that ended the conversation permanently. In the forests outside Bastogne, with German forces surrounding the beleaguered town, Kowalski knew they'd be facing Tigers. The panzer brigades had come out in force for this offensive. No flanking maneuvers would be possible in the dense woods. No artillery support could reach them through the weather. No air cover could penetrate the clouds that hung low and heavy over the battlefield. It would be tank against tank, Sherman against Tiger, David against Goliath, if David's sling only threw pebbles. But Kowalski had noticed something small, something the engineering manuals had never bothered to mention because it seemed obvious, meaningless, irrelevant. Something that kept him awake during those frozen December nights, working it through in his head, sketching diagrams on the back of ration boxes, calculating angles with a pencil stub, and the basic physics he'd learned in high school. The shells themselves, he realized, were the problem, but more specifically, how they were loaded. The M61 armor-piercing shell, used by the Sherman's 75mm gun, was a marvel of engineering for 1942. It featured a hardened steel core encased in a softer ballistic cap, designed to grip and penetrate armor plate. The propellant charge behind it was carefully balanced to provide maximum velocity without destroying the gun barrel. Everything about the shell had been optimized, except for one detail that seemed too minor to matter: the rotation. When Kowalski loaded a shell, he grabbed it from the rack, rotated it to align with the breech, and shoved it home. The process took 3 seconds for a good loader, 5 for an average one, Kowalski could do it in 2.5. But in all that practice, all that muscle memory, he'd never questioned the fundamental assumption built into the design. The shell went in straight, horizontally, level with the breech, always. But Kowalski had noticed something during a maintenance inspection back in November. The rifling inside the Sherman's gun barrel imparted a clockwise spin to the shell as it traveled down the bore. This spin stabilized the projectile in flight, improving accuracy. Standard ballistics, nothing revolutionary. What caught his attention was the angle. The rifling twisted at approximately 1 turn per 40 calibers. That meant by the time the shell left the muzzle, it had rotated roughly 9 degrees from its initial position. 9 degrees that, when the shell impacted armor at an oblique angle, created an asymmetric stress pattern. That asymmetry, Kowalski realized, might explain why their shells were sliding off Tiger armor instead of biting into it. The Tiger's frontal armor wasn't just thick. It was sloped, not dramatically, just 12 degrees from vertical, but enough that when combined with the shell's rotation and the slight variations in armor plate hardness, most American rounds skated off to the side, deflecting without penetrating. Kowalski's idea was insane, technically unsound, and violated every loading procedure he'd been trained on. But it was also simple enough to attempt with materials already inside the tank. He would pre-rotate the shell, not randomly, precisely. By carefully positioning the shell in the breech at a counterclockwise offset of approximately 8 degrees, he could compensate for the barrel's rifling. The shell would still spin during firing, but it would reach the target in a more neutral rotational state, hitting the armor more squarely, with less tendency to deflect. The offset had to be calculated for each range. Closer targets required less pre-rotation. Distant targets needed more. It would demand split-second mental calculations under combat conditions, adjustments to muscle memory developed over hundreds of loading cycles, and absolute precision in an environment of chaos and terror. But Kowalski had worked in his father's machine shop before the war. His hands knew angles, his mind knew mathematics, and his heart knew that doing nothing meant watching more friends burn. He shared his theory with nobody, not his tank commander, who would have called it reckless, not his gunner, who would have blamed any miss on the crazy loading technique, not the other loaders in the platoon, who would have thought he'd cracked under the pressure. Instead, during quiet moments between engagements, Kowalski practiced. He carved small notches on the inside of the turret, reference marks only he could see and understand. He calculated mental tables correlating range to rotation offset. He drilled the new motion until it felt almost natural, his body learning to load at an angle without his conscious mind needing to direct it. By December 17th, he was ready, or as ready as anyone could be to test an improvised ballistics theory against 56 tons of German engineering designed specifically to kill him. The Tiger emerged from the tree line like a prehistoric beast, its long 88mm gun sweeping across the snow-covered field. Behind Kowalski, Commander Lieutenant James Hartfield swore softly. Contact front, 800 yards. Gunner, target tank. Gunner Corporal Mike Delaney trained the Sherman's gun on the distant shape. Identified. Range 800. He's hull down behind that ridge, only showing turret and gun. Kowalski's hands moved to the ammo rack. 800 yards. The standard engagement would be futile at this range, but they had to try. His fingers touched the familiar shape of an armor-piercing round. Then hesitated. 800 yards. Pre-rotation offset approximately 6 degrees counterclockwise. His hand adjusted, gripping the shell differently. The motion felt wrong, foreign, contradicting 3 months of trained reflexes. But he forced his body to comply, aligning the round at the calculated angle before ramming it home. Up, he shouted. The breech clanged shut. Delaney acquired the target, made minute adjustments. The gyro stabilizer hummed, keeping the gun steady despite the idling tank's vibrations. Firing. The gun roared. The Sherman rocked backward. Smoke and flame belched from the muzzle. Through the acrid haze, Kowalski glimpsed the tracer, arcing across the frozen field. It hit high on the Tiger's turret. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a small flash, a puff of smoke, and the distinctive crack of a penetrating hit echoed across the valley. Inside the Sherman, 4 men sat in stunned silence. "What the hell?" Hartfield breathed. "Delaney, did you just—" "I don't know, sir. Clean hit. He's not moving." The Tiger sat motionless, smoke wisping from a small puncture in its turret face. Through his periscope, Kowalski watched the German tank's hatches pop open. Crew members scrambled out, running for the tree line. One clutched his face, wounded. Another limped. The Tiger was dead. Hartfield keyed the platoon radio. "Marianne to all units. Splash 1 Tiger. He's down." Static. Then, "Say again, Marianne. Did you say Tiger?" "Confirmed. Clean frontal kill at 800 yards." More static, confused voices. Disbelief. In the loader's position, Thomas Kowalski said nothing. His hands were shaking. The impossible had just become possible. But once could be luck. Twice could be coincidence. 3 times would be a pattern. Over the next 6 days, Combat Command B fought its way toward Bastogne through some of the bloodiest armored combat of the war. The weather cleared enough for limited air support, but the forests and hills forced close-range tank battles where the Sherman's disadvantages were most pronounced. Kowalski kept loading shells at angles, kept making split-second calculations of range and rotation, kept saying nothing to his crew, even as Marianne's kill count climbed to numbers that defied statistical probability. By December 22nd, Marianne had knocked out 6 Tigers and 11 Panthers. Other crews noticed. Word spread. The impossible tank that killed German heavies from the front. During a brief maintenance halt, Kowalski found himself surrounded by other loaders, all asking the same question. How? He tried to explain. Pre-rotation, compensating for rifling twist, optimizing impact angle. They stared at him like he was speaking German. "You're saying you load the shells crooked?" one asked, skeptical. "Not crooked. Angled. Precisely angled based on range, and—" "That's insane. That's physics." One of the other loaders, a kid from Texas named Rodriguez, shook his head. "Man, I barely passed high school geometry. You expect me to do calculus under fire." "It's not calculus," Kowalski insisted. "It's just pattern recognition. You see enough angles, you start to feel them. It becomes automatic." But it wasn't automatic. It took concentration, mental discipline, a kind of battlefield awareness that combined technical knowledge with intuitive understanding. Not every loader could do it. Hell, Kowalski wasn't sure he could teach it even if he tried. Still, a few were willing to experiment. Rodriguez attempted the technique that afternoon during an engagement with a Panther. His first 2 shots missed completely. The third hit but failed to penetrate. By the fourth, the Panther's gunner had found their range, and Rodriguez was too busy evacuating a burning Sherman to worry about shell rotation. Lieutenant Hartfield called Kowalski to his tent that night. The commander sat on an ammo crate, studying a map by lamplight. He didn't look up when Kowalski entered. "Sergeant," Hartfield said quietly, "I've been in this war since North Africa. Fought Rommel at Kasserine, landed at Sicily, pushed through France. In all that time, I've never seen a Sherman crew with your kill ratio against heavy armor." Kowalski said nothing. "I'm not an idiot, Sergeant. Something you're doing is different. Is it sustainable?" "I think so, sir." "Can it be taught?" Kowalski hesitated. "Maybe. To the right people. It's not just technique. It's instinct, geometry." Hartfield finally looked up, eyes tired but sharp. "After Bastogne, I want you to brief division intelligence. Whatever you're doing, if it works, we need to figure out how to scale it, how to train it, how to put it in every Sherman from here to Berlin." But Kowalski shook his head slowly. "Sir, I don't think it can scale. It requires too much mental processing, too much individual judgment. It's a hack, not a solution." "Then what's the real solution?" "Better guns, better ammunition, better tanks." Kowalski met his commander's gaze. "I'm just buying time until those arrive." The cost. The relief of Bastogne succeeded, though at terrible cost. 3rd Armored Division lost over 60 tanks during the operation. Marianne was not among them, though she took 3 hits that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. One 88mm round punched through the turret basket, missing Kowalski's leg by inches. Another struck the frontal glacis plate at such an angle that it deflected upward, tearing off the commander's periscope. A third penetrated the engine deck, starting a fire that the crew extinguished only through desperate teamwork and a lot of luck. Kowalski kept loading shells at angles, kept calculating rotation offsets, kept making the impossible slightly less impossible, one shot at a time. On Christmas Day, 1944, Mary Ann engaged a Tiger II, the even more heavily armored successor to the Tiger. The super heavy tank's frontal armor was 150 millimeters thick, sloped at 45 degrees. Every manual, every briefing, every tactical doctrine said engaging such a target from the front was suicide. Kowalski loaded a shell with a 13-degree counterclockwise offset, compensating for the extreme angle of the Tiger II's glacis plate. Delaney fired at just under 400 yards. The round struck where the turret met the hull, a weak point in the armor layout that most gunners never targeted because hitting it required impossible precision. The shell penetrated. The Tiger II erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a series of internal explosions that blew the turret 10 feet into the air. After the war, analysts would debate that shot. Some called it luck, others called it divine intervention. A few called it proof that American tankers had developed techniques that transcended their equipment's limitations. Nobody called it what it was: a 23-year-old loader from Pittsburgh applying high school physics to a 75mm shell under combat conditions, creating a tiny advantage that, multiplied across hundreds of rounds fired in anger, kept his crew alive long enough to see victory. When the war ended, Staff Sergeant Thomas Kowalski returned to Pittsburgh with a chest full of medals he never displayed and memories he rarely discussed. He went back to work in his father's machine shop, where the geometry of metal cutting made more sense than the geometry of killing. He never wrote a manual on his loading technique, never gave lectures at armor schools, never sought recognition for what he'd done in those frozen Belgian forests. When asked about his wartime service, he'd shrug and say he'd been a loader. Nothing special, just did his job. But in the archives of the 3rd Armored Division, Mary Ann's combat record remains an anomaly. 17 confirmed Tiger kills, 9 Panthers, 6 assault guns, numbers that shouldn't exist for a standard M4 Sherman with a 75mm gun. Historians examining those records have proposed various explanations: superior crew training, tactical positioning, statistical outliers, equipment variations. None quite account for the pattern. None quite explain how one tank, one crew, consistently achieved results that contradicted the fundamental balance of armored warfare. The truth is simpler and stranger. A loader who understood that sometimes the difference between success and failure, between life and death, between victory and defeat, comes down to 8 degrees of rotation and the willingness to trust your calculations, even when every instinct screams that you're wrong. In the 1950s, as American tank doctrine evolved and new vehicles replaced the Sherman, a young engineer named William Hartley, nephew of Lieutenant James Hartfield, found himself researching projectile dynamics for the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory. His uncle had told him stories about a loader who somehow made Sherman rounds penetrate Tiger armor through an improvised technique nobody fully understood. Hartley obtained Mary Ann's combat records and cross-referenced them with metallurgical analysis of recovered Sherman and Tiger armor. He studied the rifling patterns of 75mm guns. He built computer models, primitive by later standards but revolutionary for the time, simulating shell impact at various rotational states. His conclusions, published in an obscure technical journal in 1957, suggested that pre-rotating shells, to compensate for barrel rifling, could theoretically improve penetration against sloped armor by 5 to 12% under optimal conditions. The effect was marginal, difficult to reproduce, and depended heavily on the loader's ability to judge angles intuitively. The paper received little attention. By then, smoothbore guns and fin-stabilized ammunition had rendered the entire discussion obsolete. The technique Kowalski had pioneered was already an evolutionary dead end, a clever adaptation that worked only within specific constraints that no longer existed. But in that moment, in those battles, in that desperate winter when Allied forces pushed back against the last German offensive, one loader's improvised hack had tipped the balance just enough to matter. I've seen the combat footage. Grainy black and white film shot from Mary Ann's turret camera, capturing the moment a 75mm round does something it shouldn't, penetrating armor that should have been invulnerable. I've read the after-action reports, the careful military language struggling to explain results that contradicted expectations. I've stood in what remains of Mary Ann, preserved in a museum outside Washington, and tried to imagine loading shells in that cramped space while 88mm rounds searched for you. Tried to picture performing mental calculations under fire, adjusting for range and angle and the rotational offset that no manual mentioned because no one had thought it mattered. What strikes me most isn't the technical innovation, though that's impressive, it's the isolation. Kowalski never told his crew what he was doing, never sought validation or permission. He simply saw a problem, calculated a solution, and implemented it alone, accepting that if he was wrong, they'd all die, and if he was right, no one would believe him anyway. That kind of initiative doesn't appear in training manuals, can't be standardized, can't be mass-produced. It emerges from individuals who see patterns others miss, who trust their understanding even when it contradicts conventional wisdom, who improvise solutions in moments when failure means death. The M26 Pershing, with its 90mm gun, eventually gave American tankers a proper answer to German heavy armor. The post-war M46 and M47 continued that evolution. Modern battle tanks bear no resemblance to the Sherman, incorporating technologies and capabilities Kowalski couldn't have imagined. But somewhere in that progression, in that march toward ever more sophisticated weapon systems, we may have lost something important. The recognition that sometimes the human element, the creative adaptation, the desperate improvisation, matters more than the engineering specifications. Thomas Kowalski died in 1998, age 77, surrounded by family who knew him as a quiet man who loved baseball and complained about politicians and never talked about the war. His grandson found a box in the attic after the funeral. Inside, a purple heart, a silver star, a bronze star with V device, and a small notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams showing shells at various angles, surrounded by calculations in faded pencil. The notebook is now in the Army Heritage Center's collection, cataloged but rarely examined. It should be required reading for every officer who thinks war is about equipment superiority, for every engineer who believes technology alone determines outcomes, for every soldier who will someday face an enemy that seems invincible and needs to remember that impossible only means no one has figured out how yet. Mary Ann killed 17 Tigers not because American engineering was superior, but because one loader refused to accept that the numbers made victory impossible. He found a margin, a tiny geometric advantage, and exploited it with precision and courage, and an understanding that in war, sometimes the difference between winning and losing comes down to 8 degrees, and the willingness to load shells crooked when everyone else loads them straight. That's not just innovation. That's not just survival. That's history written in angles and trajectories and the stubborn insistence that there must be a way, even when every manual says there isn't. And sometimes, just sometimes, being stubborn enough, smart enough, and desperate enough to find that way is what changes everything. This is a work of fiction. While inspired by historical events and the real challenges faced by Sherman tank crews during World War II, the specific story of Thomas Kowalski and his improvised shell-loading technique is entirely imaginary. The M4 Sherman's difficulties against German heavy armor were real, as were the tremendous courage and ingenuity of American tank crews, but no historical evidence supports the particular technique described in this narrative.